If the recent Stoneman Douglas shootings within Parkland, Florida have shown us anything, it's that political change can happen from the most grassroots of forms. Not more than 2 days ago, students exactly like myself, ages younger and older, organized several marches around the world talking about how gun violence and restrictions have to be put into place. Specifically, not just to reduce gun shootings and violence in school settings, but also to make sure that the constituents of the United States are protected in the most effective forms as necessary. But it's specifically examples like these, where students recognize new evocative measures to act on their own, that brings us to scenarios exactly like today's, in which we can look at foreign policy in determining the crux of how students like myself can create a new upbringing in implementation and terms for international conflicts. So today, in discussing my presentation, we first have to look at defusing the Kurdish crisis, which is what my entire layout is going to be talking about. The Kurds are a nomadic group that currently reside within the entirety of the Middle East, but more specifically within four main countries: Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. The Kurds are currently living within these countries that are completely war-torn, and on top of that, are dealing with extremely weak leadership. So in the current power vacuum that there is to gain that power in the first place, the Kurds are just trying to find a place to live. But the problems that they're facing are several. First, they're dealing with the Syrian refugee crisis. Second, the Syrian civil war. Third, international persecution. Fourth, the deniability from the United States. And fifth, they're not able to actually find a place to live that isn't volatile. Now, that brings us to my question. Should the United States back the creation of an independent Kurdistan? To which my answer is absolutely. And in my showcase later this April, I'm going to be discussing everything according to this plan, layout, and providing context exactly like I just did. But more looking at the details, my talking points are going to revolve around two main things. The first is the United States Congress, and the second is the UN, or United Nations. But more specifically, I'm going to be creating a layout of how these two groups can actually help in the crisis. So what I'm going to be talking about revolves around foreign policy, but more specifically about what exactly is happening to the Kurds. So I'm going to be looking at the precursors to their political whereabouts, but then after what my plan is what's going to happen after that. So I'm looking at the causes and effects of their current scenarios, and specifically how the four countries that I just mentioned incorporate themselves into that plan. Political ideologies can always change, which is something that I'm trying to plan out for. Limitations are going to increase my credibility, but in the process are going to be making sure that my plan of implementation and solution are all well laid out. Moving on, my speech structure and organization is going to push itself on several main factors. The first of these factors is by making sure that I talk about, first, context. Background information is an important part of my entire presentation because a lot of the viewers aren't going to know what I'm going to be talking about. Second, I'm going to be transitioning myself onto existing solutions and why those haven't worked. This is going to make sure that my audience understands the full scale of the issue and specifically why old programs aren't going to be as ineffective as the current ones. And from that point on, I'll transition on to my own solution. Specifically, that I'm going to be repartitioning Iraq and making sure that there's a new congressional referendum with a slapping on of economic sanctions on the four countries that I already talked about. In doing so, I'm going to be building upon my last point in exposing the often strenuous mishaps of the previous solutions and looking at why those didn't work and why mine will. And finally, I'm going to be talking about an eventual conclusion and implementation plan. So specifically, I'm going to be talking to congressional participants and congressional senators, as well as people that work within the UN and possibly the State Department. But after examining all of this, we have to look at my actual presentation, where visuals are actually integral. Now, I'm going to be using two main visuals. The first is a PowerPoint and the second is a trifold. The PowerPoint is going to follow through on a chronological scale of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to incorporate solely pictures and make sure that everything is coherent. And my trifold is going to be basically a mirror version of that, but I'm going to have far more details on what's actually happening. So if people lose sight of what I'm talking about in my speech, My trifold should cover a majority of that. Moving on, the TED and mentor techniques that I learned come fourfold. First, I'm going to incorporate humor. Second, I'm going to practice relentlessly. Third, I'm going to make sure that I work on my gestures being minimalist. And finally, I'm going to make sure that I incorporate subtle senses of pictures only, as well as being transitional throughout my entire speech, because I want to teach my audience something new. Starting off with first, humor. I'm going to incorporate jokes such as this. Former President Ronald Reagan once said that the 9 most dangerous words you'll ever hear are, "We're from the government and we're here to help." And if not quotes, I can simply use political anecdotes that make the entire situation within the Middle East seem whimsical. And then after doing that, simply transition it on to more humanized impacts to make everything that I just talked about be put into context more. Practicing relentlessly is just going to be one huge cycle of speech after speech after speech. And as for gestures, that's something I've been working on, because gesturing too much makes you look nervous, but under-gesturing makes you look not too prepared. Finally, we're going to be looking at my future work. I need to do 2 main things in the future. The first is increasing joint clauses within the legislation and specifically resolutions. And second, I need to increase my research clauses on my legislation to make sure that everything is far more intricate. Finally, I'm going to have to increase my own output in terms of future obstacles. And in doing so, I need to crack down on my own inadequacies, increase my work time, and call with Mr. Loftus to make sure everything is locked down and completed. In conclusion, working towards a new future is going to be hard to do, but students can have a large part in that. Thank you.